So really quickly, I'm going to run through A again. I know we solved it yesterday, but we started off by finding our discriminant, which was b squared minus 4 times a times c, which gave us 8. And then we simplified the square root of 8 by removing the perfect square, which is 4 times 2, which got us 2 root 2. And then, now that we have that, now we're ready to do the entire quadratic formula, which was x equals, and it's the opposite of b. So if b is negative 4, the opposite would be positive 4, plus or minus my discriminant. That's all over 2 times a, which is 2. So this is where we ended yesterday. Am I correct? This is where we got? All right, so what we did not do is simplify. Now, your first test is 2 weeks from today. In order to get full credit, you do have to simplify. And when I say simplify, I'm saying look at these 3 numbers. Everything except what's underneath the square root. So these 3 numbers right here. That 2 underneath the radical cannot be simplified. But can those 3 numbers, do they have a common factor? Can I divide them by something? We can divide those 3 numbers that I have highlighted in pink. We're going to divide those by 2. So that's going to give me 2 plus or minus 1 square root of 2 all over 1. Now, when you divide by 1 or multiply by 1, you don't necessarily need to put that. So this 1 does not need to be there. Okay, dividing by 1 and also multiplying the square root of 2 by 1 does not need to be there. So I would also accept this answer for full credit. This is the better answer. But technically, I wouldn't mark you wrong if you gave me either one of those. So now that we have finished part A, we're ready to go to question B. So everyone find your discriminant. B squared minus 4ac. So A is 4, B is negative 1, and C is 2. So B squared, negative 1 squared, minus 4 times A times C. Yeah, so this is actually called the discriminant. The part of the quadratic formula under the square root is called the discriminant. So what do you get when you type that in your calculator? Negative 31. Anyone else get negative 31? All right, if you're not sure, pick up a calculator and type it in. We got to practice. The practice is now for the test that is in 2 weeks. So using your calculator, typing in the discriminant, that's all things that you should be doing now in class instead of 2 weeks from now when it's a test. So you should get negative 31. Now keep in mind that this is what is underneath the square root. So you're going to take the square root of negative 31. So we haven't talked about this yet, but when you have a negative underneath a square root, you have to take it out. You cannot leave a negative under a square root. So I'm going to take it out and write it as negative 1 times positive 31. Would you agree that negative 1 times 31 is the same thing as negative 31? All right, if you see a negative, we have to take it out. Now, the next thing we're going to do is see if we can simplify that 31. Can 31, is there a perfect square that goes into 31? So can I divide 31 by 4, 9, 16, 25? No, 31 is a prime number. So does anyone remember from Algebra 2, what is the square root of negative 1? I. So this is going to be written as I root 31. So now that we have that, we're ready to do our quadratic formula. This is my discriminant. So this is what goes here. So now we're ready to finish it out. So it would be x equals, now it's the opposite of b. So if b is negative 1, what's the opposite of negative 1? Positive 1. So positive 1 plus or minus I square root of 31, and that's all over 2 times a. And a is 4, and what is 2 times 4? 8. Now, we cannot simplify this any further because we have 1 and a 1. And the only number that divides into 1 is 1. So this cannot be simplified. This would be my final answer. That would be my final answer. So now we're getting ready to do the last piece of Appendix 6, which is homework 1. We talked about factoring. We talked about the quadratic formula. And what's the third method to solve a quadratic? Completing the square. So in your notes, let's go ahead and talk about completing the square. So I want to give you a couple of minutes to copy down these steps that I have off to the side. So go ahead, take a minute, copy down those 6 steps, and we're going to work through a few of these questions together. And that's what we're going to focus on for the rest of the class period, is this method. Who has learned this method before, completing the square? I think for many people this is new, which is why we're going to go pretty slow. So take a minute, copy down those 6 steps, and then we'll work through some examples together. So this method is the only method that you don't start off by setting it equal to 0. So when we factor it, we want it to equal 0. When we use the quadratic formula, we want it to equal 0. But when we complete the square, we don't want it to equal 0. So when you're finished writing down the 6 steps, if you could put your pencils down, that way I know who I'm waiting on. So I can give you another couple minutes to copy those down, and then we're going to start working through some examples. let's go ahead and get started. So your first step is going to be to move the C value over. So when I complete the square, I only want 2 terms to be on the left. So my first step is going to be to subtract the 15. Step number 2 is going to be to factor out that A value. So on the left, do you see how A is 3? We need to take the 3 out, but I'm only dividing these 2 terms by 3. I'm not going to divide this negative 15 by anything. I'm only dividing these 2 terms that you see on the left by 3. So that gives me 3. And then x squared minus 8x, and that equals negative 15. Now, when you divide both of those sides by 3, both of those terms by 3, my new b value is negative 8. So now we're on step 3 where it says add b over 2 squared. I'm not adding negative 24 is not my b value anymore. Because I factored out a 3, this is now my b value. So I want you to take this negative 8, divide that by 2, and square it. So negative 8 divided by 2 squared. And this will always be a positive number. Because remember, every number squared is positive. So negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. And negative 4 times negative 4 is 16. So that is what I'm going to put right here. What I am doing is creating a perfect square. Inside of that parentheses, I'm creating a perfect square. Now this is not balanced. Okay, because I just added something that was not already there. But what number did I add? I didn't just add 16, because remember, everything inside of this parentheses is really multiplied by 3. So what I really added to create my perfect square was 3 times 16. So on this to this negative 15, to keep it balanced, I'm going to add 3 times 16. So you can do anything in an equation to solve it, but it has to be balanced. I can't do something on the left that I don't do on the right. So I added 16 3 times to create this perfect square. I have to do the same thing on the right. So now we're here at step 4, which is factor. So I want you to factor this down. And that should be a perfect square. So what 2 numbers multiply to be positive 16 and add to negative 8? It's always going to be the same number. So what's my magic number? Not 4, but negative 4. Because negative 4 squared is 16. And negative 4 plus negative 4 is negative 8. So what this is going to factor down to, I'm going to write it out the long way, is 3. And then I have x minus 4 twice. Go ahead in your calculator. Figure out what this is. Negative 15 plus 3 times 16. What is this number? What is it? 33. Okay. Now in algebra or math, anytime we have something written twice, what's another way to write x minus 4 times x minus 4? X minus 4 squared. So that's how I'm going to write that. This is where this square is coming in. Okay, we almost done. That's the hard part. The rest is easy. So now we're still trying to solve for x. The next thing we need to do is get rid of that 3. The 3 is being multiplied by the parentheses. So how do I get rid of the 3? What's the opposite of multiplication? Divide. Divide both sides by 3. So that gives you x minus 4 squared equals 11. Now we have to get rid of the square. What's the opposite of squaring something? Square root. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. And that gives you x minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 11. Because whenever you take the square root, there's 2 answers. A lot of times we only focus on one answer. But for example, the square root of 25 is plus and minus 5. The square root of 100 is plus and minus 10. The square root of 11 is plus and minus square root 11. Okay, so now I'm almost done. The last thing I'm going to do to solve for x is what? If this said x minus 4 equals 11, what would you do to get rid of the negative 4? Add it. But here's the thing. You cannot add anything to a square root. So when I add that 4, it just drops in front. So I'm going to add that 4 to both sides. What I don't want you to do, I'm going to write what you don't do. Don't tell me that this is the answer, because this is wrong. That's completely wrong. I am not adding that 4 to the 11. That's not correct. So what I'm going to have as my final answer is x equals positive 4 plus and minus the square root of 11. That is my answer. And that's solving using completing the square method. So our test is in 2 weeks. Generally, this is the hardest question only because this, for many of you, is a new process. Okay, so that's what we're going to spend today practicing this process. You've all factored and you've all used the quadratic formula, but this is a new method. So you ready to do another one? Let's do another one. I'm going to walk you through another one, and then I'm going to take off the training wheels and let you ride and see how many of you are with me. All right, so copy down this second one here. And again, we're going to complete the square. We're going to do this one together. And I will tell you, I started off with the hardest one. These next 3 are going to be a lot easier because we don't have to worry about step 2 because A is 1. So we're going to walk through completing the square. Solving by completing the square. So what do you think I'm going to do first? 71. Add the 71. For completing the square, you do not want it to equal 0. So I'm not going to add the 3. I want to move the 71 over. So let's add 71. Go ahead and get with your calculator, see what you get. Okay. So now we need to complete the square. Notice that A is 1, so I don't need to divide both of these two because I already have that 1 that I need here. Okay, in my last example, I had a 3. I had to take it out to get to the 1. But in this example, I already have a 1. Okay, so now we can skip over 2 and go to 3, which is adding b over 2 squared to both sides. So that would be negative 4 divided by 2 squared. So negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. And negative 2 times negative 2 is 4. So I'm going to add that 4 to both sides. Okay, this is going to factor down to a perfect square. This is always going to factor down to something squared. So don't say it out loud. See if you can figure out what that factors down to squared. It's going to factor down to, you need 2 numbers that multiply to be a positive 4 but add to a -4. So don't say it out loud. Give everybody a chance to think it through. Thumbs up if you know what it factored down to. All right. What is it factored down to? X what? X -2. So X -2. Who had that? X -2. All right. Now, what do you get when you add 68 plus 4? 72. So now we got to get rid of the exponent. So we're going to take the square root. Now, the last example, we had 11. 11 can't be simplified, but 72 can. 72, so we have X -2 equals plus or minus. So 72 can be broken down to 36 times 2. 36 is a perfect square. So that's why it's going to break down to X -2 equals plus or minus 6 root 2. So that's the hard part. So my last step is to get rid of the -2. How would I get rid of the -2? Add it. Now again, I'm not adding it to the 6, and I'm not adding it to that 2. That 2, which is going to come right here, right in front of that plus or minus. So your final answer is X equals +2 plus or minus 6 root 2. All right, so we did 2 together. So now I'm going to take off. I'm going to let y'all ride. Let me give you an example. I want you to try to work through it on your own, and I will be coming around to answer questions. All right, so let me clear this out. All right, so what I want you all to do is we have X squared plus 16X minus 3 equals 9. So take a minute and see if you can get the answer. When you get the answer, raise your hand and I will tell you if I agree. I got that. So, yeah, X plus E squared, yeah. Yeah, 672 squared. That's what I got. So 4 times 19. All right. Not bad. Not many of us made it there, but that's okay because it was some good math thinking going on. So let's go ahead and work through it together, and then I'm going to give you a second example. All right, so I need everybody's attention. The answer, the only answer that would be correct is -8 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 19. If you didn't get that, I need everybody to lock in. Let's figure it out. Okay. The first step would be what? What should we do first? Add 3. So on a good note, everybody I saw added 3. So we got a half a point. That's what we should have. So now we need to complete the square because this is incomplete. And I need to create a perfect square. So the number that I'm going to add to create a perfect square is going to be half of 16 squared. So 16 divided by 2 is 8, and 8 squared is 64. So that's the number that I'm adding on both sides. So I want you all to correct if you did not, I want you all to correct. So a lot of you all made it to this step. And then we said, okay, now I don't know what to do. All right, now step 4 is to factor. So this, I need 2 numbers that multiply to be 64 and add to 16. And it's always going to be the same number. And in this example, it would be 8 times 8. So do you agree that 8 times 8 is 64? Yes. And 8 plus 8 is 16? Yes. Okay. So this is going to factor down to x plus 8 times x plus 8 is 76. But in math, we don't write things twice. Instead of saying x plus 8, we write it as x plus 8 squared. So now we're ready to take the square root of both sides. 76 is not a perfect square, but it can be broken down to 4 times 19. So that means I have x plus 8 equals plus or minus 2 square root of 19. And then my last step is to subtract 8. So this would be your final answer. It is okay if you did not make it to the finish line. I don't expect you to, on the second try. Joshua, I was right. Wait, one more time. Why is it a perfect square if 38 is on the top?
No, 38 times.
Okay, that's a great question. Okay, so let's talk about perfect squares. I don't have no chalk out here. So what is a perfect square? Let's talk about that. All right, so hold on, y'all. Let me find some chalk. This is a good question because, again, I need for y'all to understand because realistically, tomorrow we moving on to something else. All right. So let's talk about what is a perfect square. So 1 times 1 doesn't count. What's 2 times 2? 3 times 3? 4 times 4? 5 times 5? 6 times 6? 7 times 7? 8 times 8? 9 times 9? And 10 times 10? All right. So, is 2 in this list?
No.
Joshua, is 2 on this list? What about 38? If it's not a number in this list, then you do not touch the square root. The only time I'm going to take and break apart something is if I'm taking out one of these. So if you're not, leave it alone. So 4 can come out of 76. That's why I broke it apart. All right. We got time to do one more. Oh, yes, Kimmy.
On our last example question, we had to add 4 onto the side of.
Let me go back. We had to add the 4.
Yeah, you put the 4 there.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I thought on the question we just did now, when I subtracted over 8 onto 2 square root of 9, I thought it would go to -6 square root. 19.
Okay.
Go to -6
No.
square root.
So this cannot be touched. You cannot mess with the square root.
Okay.
Ever.
So I would just add it in front of the plus and minus
That's it.
every time.
Every time. All right, let's do another one. Okay. X squared minus 20x minus 9 equals 14. Go ahead and complete the square. Good. You on there? All right. So this one you have the square root of 123, which cannot be simplified. So we're just going to say none of those numbers divide into 123. So we just leave it as 123. All right. May not have time to go through this one fully, but you should get x equals 10 plus or minus the square root of 123. Tomorrow we are going to practice this some more.